Welcome to the Acts 29 podcast. Acts 29 is an organization and global network of churches that exist to plant churches worldwide. Now here's your host, Vice President of Acts 29 Church Planting, Dr. Adam Flint.
Well, fellas, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks.
Good to have you.
Thanks, brother.
Yeah, well, hey, why don't you introduce yourself, where you live,
Sure.
pastor, part Acts 29, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. David Fairchild. I've been in Houston for the last 5 years at Christ Community Church, been with Acts 29 since around 2001, and have seen its various iterations and have been blessed to be part of this network.
Okay,
for a
so
long,
Dave,
long time.
literally until this moment right here, I thought your church was called C3.
We do call it C3.
And I didn't know it was Christ Community Church. I was like,
yeah.
what kind of name is C3?
Very godly.
I'm just relieved to hear that.
There's Clear Creek Community Church, and we're trying to get them to call their church C4.
There you go, C4.
It's just dynamic and explosive.
Just down the
That's
road.
just too corny.
Got to do too many C's in Houston.
Exactly.
Right on. Chris?
Chris Lewis, and I'm in Glendora, California. It's a suburb of LA, on the east side of LA. Been there for 18 years, actually this past Sunday. And I pastor a church called Foothill Church. Yeah. I didn't plant it.
years?
Did not plant it.
Yeah.
It's a replant, kind of a revitalization. And yeah, so I've been there 18 years. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So we got West Coast, Texas, East Coast.
Yep.
So we'll have all the U.S. perspectives here.
Yeah.
So cool. Well, we've been in a little bit of a mini series on the podcast, and we're just asking the question: what's one thing you tell a church planter? Not what's the most important thing necessarily, or the only thing you should worry about, but just what's one thing as you're planting? Keep your eye on this. Think about this. So, Dave, what you got? What's one thing?
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. I when I first started as a pastor, I didn't have any preaching background whatsoever.
Yeah.
So I had taught a couple of times in different contexts, but I had to learn preaching as I did it, which was very painful. In the first 5 years, I didn't know myself. I didn't know the audience that I was preaching to. I had this audience in my head that I thought the church was supposed to be, but then people showed up and they were very different than what I expected. And it all depended on who I was reading. You know, if I was reading the Puritans, I kind of started to sound like the Puritans. If I was reading Piper, I sounded like Piper.
Yep.
So my wife was a little confused because she's like, who is that guy? And what is he saying? And why are you saying it? And so the thing that I would love to talk about is just really encouraging, especially guys that are just getting going in preaching, to continue to do the work that they need to do exegetically, to really make sure that they understand what the author's intentions are. But they have to hone the craft of preaching evangelistically. They have to see preaching as mission, and to treat preaching as the great honor that it is, of course, to nourish folks that are already Christians, but to really take to the task of preaching. You know, Keller used to say this: preach as if Christians are already there. And when you do that, something strange happens. They start showing up. And the reason is quite simple. Your people are not just more comfortable in bringing their neighbor and friends and coworkers and family because they know that they're going to hear the gospel, but also you are modeling for them how to talk about the gospel in a way that makes sense.
Yep.
And so if you're preaching evangelistically, it means, and I don't think these are in competition. You can, on the one hand, simultaneously nourish the saints.
That's right.
While also making sure you always leave space in both your heart and your mind and your prep for the person that may not understand the things that you're saying. And just creates an environment for people to explore in a way that might be different than if you're just doing what I did the first 5 years and trying to prove yourself to yourself. That I know all the theology, I know all the doctrine, and I've done my exegesis, and my preaching is sound. And I think I spent more time being sermon-centered than I was God and people-centered. And so I would say, develop the skill of preaching evangelistically. And I don't necessarily mean I wouldn't even methodologically get into a debate of like, do you do altar calls? That's not really the point.
Right.
Call people to faith.
Yep.
But make sure if you're going to preach evangelistically that you preach the gospel every single week, that every sermon, Jesus is the hero. And I say that because I think in the rush of the last 15 years or so, in the movement of gospel centrality, we've presumed upon everyone understanding the gospel, and we think that saying the gospel 30 times in a sermon is tantamount to preaching the gospel. It's like, no, You've got to articulate what the gospel is. If you are clear about what the gospel is, if you are making Christ the hero of every sermon, you will be evangelistic. You're not only evangelizing your people and winning them their heart to Christ again, but you're evangelizing non-Christians because the problem is the same. The reason why I sin is the same reason why someone else sins.
Yeah, and you can't have this, like, the gospel is only for people who aren't Christians. That's just a false idea of the gospel. It saves you and keeps you your entire life. So we all need that, all of us. I mean, I need it while I'm preaching as much as the guy that's unsaved needs it.
Hey, Dave, I have a question. So go back to your first 5 years. Like literally because we can talk about how, hey, don't try to imitate Keller, don't try to imitate whoever that is, right? I'm not sure that anybody can actually break free of that imitation stage just because you're trying to find your voice, right? And it sounds like that was at least part of what you were going to say. I thought that's where you were going to go, actually.
Yeah,
I was like, he was going to talk about find your voice.
He didn't tell us. I'm like, oh, we're going to do a voice conversation here.
But on that issue, how do you, what would you say to first 5 year Dave that you weren't doing other than, hey, did you feel like your nose was just too much in a book and not looking at your people enough?
Yeah.
What could those guys do in those first 5 years to go, man, boy, instead of this, do this, or how would you have redirected yourself practically?
That's a great question. I think a couple quick things come to mind. Number one, I think I overdid it in terms of my studies. I know that sounds really counterintuitive.
No, I actually think that's very true of early preachers.
Keller talked a lot about this, about size dynamics, and that when you're a smaller church, you can grow as a preacher because people love you because they know you.
Right.
But when you're a larger church, then they only know you through your preaching, and so your preaching, you need to have, your preaching needs to be decent.
Right.
I think our preaching should always be decent, but I think for me, I kid you not, I would probably buy between 12 to 20 commentaries on whatever book I was working through, and I would read all of them. And so I was putting an inordinate amount of time, 20, 25, 30, sometimes hours into preparing a sermon for 30 people.
Yeah.
And I felt like I had, like...
The upshot of that is that you're one of the smartest people I know.
I don't know about that, but it was, the sermons were painful. Like I'm so glad that they can't be found online, and please don't go looking for them.
Would you, by the way, would you preach longer back then?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, and not just longer, but more... I'm not an academic, but more academically oriented. Yeah. So what happened is the people in San Diego that were a part back then, early 2000s, people were kind of doing their own form of deconstruction back then, coming out of big kind of entertainment-oriented type churches, and we became kind of the smart church. And so people came to us to grow doctrinally and theologically. Yeah. But the fact is they were still the same. They still didn't love their neighbors. They still weren't reaching the lost. They still weren't becoming more willing to forgive, and their heart was not being changed. So the second thing I'd say, so one, I would go back and tell my younger self, hey, get some good commentaries that you trust, but don't overdo it, because you're going to go into the pulpit with all that information, and you're going to be having these debates in your head that no one's interested in. The second thing I would say is I had a good mentor, Dick Coffin, back then, that was the founder and leader of Harbor Church Movements, and he would mentor me, so I'd get together with him once a month, and it was a fearful thing when Dick said, hey, do you want me to listen to some of your sermons and offer some critique? I said, yeah, sure. And he did. And he was a wonderful, he just passed last year, and he was a wonderful, godly man. But one of the things he said to me, of course, in Dick's way, he says, hey, you have, it's exegetically sound, it's good expository preaching, like Christ is big, you have this supreme Christ that you're preaching in the text, you understand culture, that's all great. And I was like, almost breaking my arm to pat myself on the back. And then he said this little throwaway comment, and then kind of just let it sit. He said, but it's Christ-centered, it's not gospel-centered. And I was like, what? And he said, David, you have a big exalted Christ, but because it's not gospel-centered, you're just crushing your people. Oh, wow. How does anyone live up to the majesty and the glory and the splendor of Jesus? So you're doing your job of exalting Christ, but your people are probably walking away crushed. And I was just tacking on the gospel at the end of the sermon before we took communion. Yeah. And I think since then, it has been a constant fight to make sure that the whole story arc of the sermon is to show not only the supremacy of Christ, but that Christ became man, and that Christ did for us what we couldn't do for ourselves. That you're bringing that story arc relief and what Christ has accomplished for us, and being just super clear about what that is. And every week you get to do it in a different way. So you get to preach the gospel in 1,000 different ways. The other thing I would say, last thing I would say is, I just didn't know myself. Keller said, what does it take? 300 sermons before you know who you are? And that's about true. It took me about 300 or 400 sermons before I got to a point where I could say, I think I know who I am. I'm not trying to be anybody else. But this is corny, and it kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier. You do have to find your voice. You have to figure out who you are. And just be you. Be an authentic version of you.
Yeah. And I think, on the voice thing, be influenced by some people. There's a difference between that and imitating some people. And maybe at the very beginning of your preaching, but you got to get out of the imitation pretty quick. And I remember we did a assessment one time, and it became very clear when this guy did his preaching that he was very, very, very influenced by one particular preacher. You could see it in his voice, hear it in his voice, see it in his mannerisms, all that. And he was correct. He was good. He just wasn't himself. And what we came out of assessment and told him was, you're not allowed to listen or watch to this guy. You can read him. It's fine. But it was just a good reminder to me to there needs to be a breadth to the people that are influencing me. So if you're listening into one person or two people all the time, it's going to be harder to find your voice. And
I've always thought of it like when I was in grade school and we were all learning to write. Remember, they would give you those sheets, and you had to do an A just this way. You repeated it over, and you're getting muscle memory. That's really what they were teaching you. And I think so. I do believe that the imitation is a real part of formation.
Right.
But I don't want to keep my hand on that paper the rest of my life. I want to graduate where I have my own cursive, my own printing. I want to be able to do this on my own without those kind of guides. I just think there's guys that get stuck in that. They get stuck in that's the standard. Piper, Keller, name your guy.
Right.
He's the standard. And I just want to imitate him because he does it so well. And if you don't find your own voice, then your people really never have the benefit of what God would want to do through you.
That's right.
Right? They get who they would want to, they get Keller showing up in a lame version.
Right. Well, that's
Not very good Keller.
God already created a Keller.
Yeah.
God put you in that place to be you with those people, to use you in that place. And if he didn't want you, he'd take you out and put somebody else there. And so, I think that is one. And the other part is, if you let that imitation go on too long, it guts you eventually as because you feel like you're just pretending and performing constantly.
You are.
And it is what feels expedient and good and quick and eventually just becomes exhausting. Exhausting.
My daughter and I, this is embarrassing to admit, I probably shouldn't admit it, but my daughter and I, one of our great joys when she was younger is watching American Idol together. And the only reason why I really like the auditions.
Hey, don't apologize for doing anything with your daughter.
Good. Yeah, no, that's true.
If you have a daughter that wants to do anything with you,
she loved it. And her favorite part of watching American Idol were really the auditions, not when the season got going, but the actual auditions. And I remember one time, Simon Cowell said to it was a female singer. She came up and she sang this song, and she was pitch perfect. And I remember the panel was sitting there, and he said, "You're pitch perfect. Your tone was great." I'm not a musician, so I don't know all the things that he said. But he leaned forward and he said, "But I don't believe you." And there is something about that struck with me. It's like you can say all the right things and even be influenced by the right men and follow the patterns of what they do, but that believability part, that you being uniquely you, a sanctified version of yourself that is free to worship the living Christ in the act of preaching. You cannot avoid that.
Yeah. But okay, so to circle back, because we got off on a little bit of a voice thing, which I think is really, really good. But this plays directly into the evangelistic preaching. There is no greater strategy for evangelism than the local church, and specifically church planting. And And the proclamation of the gospel is the way God is going to do that. That's Romans 10, right? I mean, the way Romans 8 works out is Romans 10. Mm-hmm. And in preaching, I love that you brought this up, because we don't just want to create in church planting organizations in which a preacher just gets to preach for the sake of preach. That is there as a, like, God ordained this thing for a purpose, the proclamation of the gospel, and to invite people, to receive Jesus in faith.
Yeah.
And he says, you got to believe in your heart, confess with your mouth. Like, if we don't doing that in our preaching, I mean, how are people going to learn to do it individually? How's that going to happen?
Well, and you we said this earlier, but you help them by you articulating the gospel and recognizing you're not only forming the saints, you're discipling the saints through your preaching, but you're also talking as if someone who doesn't know Jesus is there. And by the way, someone who doesn't know Jesus is there every week, even if they all look like they're Christians. There are people that do not believe, and they need to be called to faith. Yeah. And so what you're doing is you are helping them understand how to have this conversation about who Jesus is in a way that is not only helpful for them. It's like why apologetics. People assume apologetics is always for the non-believer, and it's like, apologetics is so much more for the believer. Because it helps us recognize that we have a justifiable faith, and these things just strengthen us and bolster our trust. But if you're preaching in a way that you are making Jesus a hero, and you're preaching the gospel, and you're calling people to faith, you're calling your people to faith every week, and you're calling anyone that's there to faith every week, and you're actually calling them to repent and believe the gospel, and because you're articulating the gospel, there's something in that is, Spurgeon was asked a question one time. He always would ask these weird questions, but he was like, if I were not allowed to enter into heaven, where would I prefer to reside? And he said, in the pulpit, because it's there that I feel the closest to God. And I've had those experiences, and the last few years in particular, I've started to enjoy preaching more and more, and where I just feel so close to Christ, and I'm so desperate for people to know Him, and to see how beautiful He is, and how just majestic and how kind and gracious He is. But as you're doing that, if you're caught up in worship rather than just being mad at the people that you think are wrong, and usually preachers that preach mad are preaching to not the people in front of them, but some group outside the church that they're angry at. But if you're preaching as if Christians are there, and you're worshiping yourself, and you're preaching evangelistically, and you're getting to the gospel, and you're actually articulating what the gospel is, you are not only going to worship yourself, but you're going to find that people are magnetically attracted to that. One of when I came to Houston 5 years ago, you're looking for marks when you're trying to get a church from being more Bible church to an outward orientation. Some of the early marks to turn a church missionwards is that your people begin to feel comfortable inviting people to church on Sunday. And it's a great compliment to you as a preacher. If you know how risky that is. Like, you think back to those days, those early days when we weren't doing this every week, to invite a friend that didn't know Jesus, or to invite a coworker, if that goes poorly, that could be terrible. And so when people start feeling comfortable being able to bring a non-Christian, not because you're going to say non-Christian things, but because they know they can trust you're going to steward that well. It's one of the best compliments.
Yeah. And I think, especially in our tribe with kind of a reformed soteriology, there can often be a pushback. It's like, well, God's sovereign over salvation, so why call people of faith? Why do an invitation? And I would go, you have it all wrong. If that's where your theology leads you, that kind of theology should actually make us the most bold, invitational, evangelistic, missional, because we go, you know what? It's not my job to convince you. It's my job to introduce you to Jesus, let the Spirit of God do what He wants to do. And if nobody comes to faith that day and I give an invitation, it's not a reflection on me.
That's right.
It's just what God wanted to do that day.
Yeah.
And it'll keep you out of pride, and it'll keep you out of this like agony that it hung on you. And you just don't want to live and die by that.
You were mentioning in the last podcast, you're talking about personal evangelism as a planner, as a pastor. I think if you're not personally evangelizing, you will not be an evangelistic preacher. because it is in those moments of having conversations with people that don't know Jesus, you have to actually fumble through it.
Yeah.
That sharpens your understanding of how to articulate this. Because you may have fumbled it there, but now you get a chance to write a sermon and prepare and like get up and actually, here's what I wish I would have said to that person, that barista that I talked to.
Yeah.
And so I don't think it's possible for you to be a really effective preacher evangelistically if you're not actually exercising personal evangelism in your own life.
And if I'm meeting people who are far from Christ, my heart breaks for them.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, it's not like, well, I gotta share the gospel. It's like, what else would I want to do?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I know this beautiful Jesus, and I want you to know. And we've had conversations. So why would I not take every opportunity to go? Here he is.
I have a question actually for both of you on this, because I've wrestled with this. You preach the gospel. You want to make sure Jesus is the center. You make sure. So let's just say all those things you're hitting on those. How do you land the plane? Do you, Dave? Is that kind of that final Paul moment? I'm pleading with you, be reconciled to Christ. Does that happen in your sermon? Is that something that we just hope will happen? And I don't mean that as a criticism, by the way. I'm genuinely interested in answers to this because I come out of a revivalistic background that you did an altar call every Sunday and you actually had people come forward. So no, we don't do that. But I will say I still wrestle with this. I still wrestle with this feeling of like, do I just leave the sermon there and kind of do the mic drop and walk away? That sounds negative. If you hear what I'm saying, do I do that, or is there a place, and I mean regularly a place, for us to call people to that decision point?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, you used to say the Puritans really saw salvation as a long process, not this crisis event. I think revivalism gave us this crisis event.
The nervous bench.
Yeah.
Right. All that. So I think it's some of my background. I still wrestle with this, and I wanna steward that moment well, and I want to call people to repentance. But how do I land the plane?
Man, I think that's a great question. And I struggle with you as well. I think first and foremost, what we're called to be is faithful, not successful. We have to be faithful with the text. We have to be faithful in articulating the gospel. And I think sermons, depending upon the text, are going to dictate in many ways how the gospel shows up in it.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's along the way, and you're sort of building belief along the way, and whatever your point or subpoint is, you're building belief. And sometimes I intentionally delay gratification until the end so that I can dismount with Christ as a hero in that moment. Yeah. But one thing I will say is for us, and I know people do it differently in every church, we take communion every single week.
Right.
And for us, the beauty of that, of recognizing that there's a moment of demarcation within the community that we have to contend with.
Yeah.
That, we'll often say, hey, if you're here and you're not a Christian, or if you don't believe what I just said about who Jesus is and what Jesus has done, I would encourage you, instead of taking the bread and cup to your lip, just take Christ to your heart. Like, there has to be moments at which we call people to repent and believe the gospel.
Right. Yeah.
In whatever way we articulate it. And but I'm right with you, because you don't want it to be, well, one, if you do it the same all the time, your people are going to finish your sentence. And so you don't want to do it. You don't want to be formulaic. But I do think that one of the things that Joby does well, he's actually really challenged me on this, and just not personally, but listening to him. Joby calls people to believe in Jesus. And I think we need to be more bold. I have to be more bold in that. Now, I said I do it, but like you, I feel like I need to do it better. I need to be more confident in being able to say, hey, guys, run to him.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, run to him.
I think we're truly preaching to people who don't know Jesus, they don't know how to receive Jesus.
That's right.
And so there are times where you say, here's what this means.
Yeah.
Here's how this occurs. Here's what a receiving, a believing, a confessing, this is what that looks like. And I so appreciate you saying the text. And the way I look at it is, I want to preach to a response. And the response is not always, if you aren't a Christian, become a Christian.
Right.
And it isn't always, and even when that happens, it's not always at the end of the sermon. I mean, I've had sermons where I've said, hey, just a heads up, I want some of you all to receive Jesus. And then go into the just like it's coming. So it's not even a like gotcha moment. I mean, sometimes it's just like, this is where we're going.
So
this is what's happening.
Yes or no? Yes or no to this? Is a call to salvation an application of every sermon?
Yeah, I mean, I probably will disagree with a lot of my preaching brothers here, but I don't preach on a lot of application.
Okay.
I preach proclamation, explanation, implication.
Okay.
I want people to sense the implication of the text. I want to call them to faith. So maybe you could say my calling to faith is a kind of application to that. But I've heard your preaching. Brother, you are excellent at this. One of the things that one of the things that you do really, really well is you help people. You almost help people. Here's how you put on one sleeve to the gospel. Here's how you put on another. And you do this throughout your sermons. And so I think that is preaching the gospel. I think that is calling people to faith. And again, back to the text. Like sometimes the text. Oh, I love those weeks, don't you? Where the text just builds,
just lays it out.
Yeah, just builds the tension. And then the dismount is just so clear, like come and believe. But like you said, with every text, some texts are, is the text asking me to know something that I don't know,
right?
To believe something I don't believe, to do something that I'm not doing.
Head, heart, hands.
Is it volition? Is it emotion? Is it intellectual?
Yeah.
And every text has to dictate that.
Yeah.
So I try, and not well, I think, I try to let the aim of the text decide how I'm going to preach the gospel.
That's right. Yeah. And the other part is, if you just cut me, I bleed evangelism. I can't help it. That's a gift God has given me. It's partly the way I came to faith. I mean, there's all sorts of factors that are into that. And so part of it's just my natural bent is like, and I'll look at people and I'll see people that I know don't know Jesus, and I just go, come to Jesus. So some of it's me, and I have to guard against laying me, like eisegeting me and my gifting into that text, but also to not deny that and go, well, God put me here.
Yeah.
So
I'm asking the question. I'm asking the question because I feel like, and I'm not patting myself on the back here. I'm telling you, Steve, I feel like I 99% of the sermons, I will get there. And the reason I'm asking you this is not so that you'll validate me, but is that proper? Because again, to this day, so I've been doing this 20-something years, to this day, I think I still feel that tension.
Yeah.
And I still have this great desire to see people respond to the gospel. I want to make sure that the red line, the thread is there. I want the gospel to be clear. And so is it valid for me, for us to go, hey, every time we can bring it in and talk to people about how to respond to the message of the gospel?
Yes. And I would say, especially to church planners that are listening, like, you're the tip of the spear in this thing.
Yeah.
Like, if you're gonna err on inviting people to Jesus.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Like
that's actually, I think that's good.
And I do think legitimately there is a gospel answer to every in the text. I mean, it's why the New Testament is being written. And I think there are genuine, faithful ways to invite people to faith in Jesus.
I also think what you're feeling is appropriate, because if you look at American history and you think of the Great Awakening, there has been a debate, whether it's been as obvious in ink or just what we have from historical documents. There has been this debate on. It seems as if there has been a gravitational pull to either holiness or mission, and as if these two things are in competition with one another. It's like, no, holiness is mission. Like the fruit of the gospel is that it makes you obedient to Christ, and there is a call to holiness because the gospel is doing work in you, and so that his commandments are no longer burdensome. How can the commandments not be burdensome? Because he accomplished it all for us. And now I'm empowered to go and follow. But it is strange, even today, there is this, it feels like when you talk about preaching as mission, there are some, and I love my brothers that are theologically articulate and careful and precise, and I think that's right and that's good. But I think there's a sense in which they would feel strange if they were being too evangelistic, because in their mind, these are the saints. What I want to grow is I want to nourish them in the faith. I want them to learn doctrine, and I want them to be holy.
Yeah.
As if somehow we have to, but if we aim for mission, then we can't do that. It's like, no, good, robust preaching. Well, let the text dictate the terms. Like, we're not, pardon the expression, we're not homiletical whores. Yeah. We're not constantly trying to be so homiletically oriented that like the sermon is the main thing. It's just a text. Preach a text. Whatever's in the text, do what the text says.
And Paul says, in the gathering of the saints, be aware there are people.
That's right.
I mean, that's in the scripture saying, hey, pastor, be aware there are folks that don't believe among you. So you can faithfully believe worship is worship, and you can disciple people and be aware there are those among us that don't know Jesus yet. And a beautiful part of worship would be to invite them to come to worship Jesus.
Yeah. Would to God that people would, as Paul says, people would be so struck by our worship of the living God that they would fall on their face and say, God is really among you. Yeah. Like, would to God that
Wouldn't
would
that be amazing?
Like that our preaching would be so passionate, so filled with fire. That our hearts are so captivated by the beauty and majesty of Christ that people that are there as visitors would just like, he's alive. He must be real.
Yeah. And I mean, to your question, Chris, I think there are lots of ways to even do a like gospel invitation of receive and believe. Like, yes, it can happen at the end of a sermon and stand up or raise your hand, come down front at communion. There's all these, there's people at the back after a service in a benediction. So I don't think the method is how we get caught up. The real question to me is like, if you're not doing it, what is it in me? Because more often there's fear, there's disbelief that the Spirit is actually going to do something in that moment. Like the issue's usually with me, not like, again, not a theology.
Yeah, no.
Because any good theology will lead you to evangelism. And so,
that's good. That's really good. Yeah.
Well, let's just for a few minutes, I want to ask you, what's one thing you'd be?
And you asked me this, and I've thought about this. I guess there's several things. I will give you the one, and I'll just put it simply. I think I would take Paul's admonition very seriously to not be hasty with the laying on of hands. This is just, I think this is born out of watching, and it's not because I think I did something great here I want everybody to hear about, because it's not that. It's that I've watched now. We were just talking about church planting and, those that have been successful and those that have failed and those that are struggling. And I would say in my 18 years in Southern California, a large number of churches that are no longer in existence, or the pastor who is no longer serving, or some big church issue that popped up, was driven by elders. I want to make sure I'm a firm believer in eldership.
Totally.
We have elders. But I think in our haste to be theologically correct and make sure that our polity matches up with what we say we believe, that very often we can run through some barriers, get some guys around us that we think, okay, finally I've got my guys, we're a church, however you conceive of that. And the upshot of that is that you may have not vetted or walked with these people long enough. You're too soon into the church planting process to really appoint those. So when Paul says, it says to Timothy and to Titus, Titus, I left you in Crete to set in order what remains and appoint elders in every city. He never gives them a timeline. We don't know how long Titus was in Crete before he started.
And there was a church plant there that didn't have elders.
Yeah.
So there was some process by which that was getting
there.
Yeah.
And I've just had conversations. I've had conversations with guys over the years where I think they thought, if I can find guys who are biblically qualified, good enough. And I just think that's such a mistake to rush into that. I've just heard, and all of us have, horror stories of of a pastor who goes, something happens, he gets a little bit sideways, and suddenly there's a takeover, there's a coup, there's he's now out, or he did not realize what and so there's 1,000 ways that story gets told. But one of the common denominators is if you'd have just slowed the whole process down and just been patient and just waited. And look, I'm not a huge advocate of this whole external board thing that, people do for decades, right? I get it.
Yeah.
I get when you're first starting out and you need to have that kind of thing in place because you need to have some mature, godly men speaking into you.
That's right.
And you should desire and move towards eldership. Just go slow and be really methodical and train where those guys don't have the training. And when Paul says test them. I don't know what that has to, we all have to decide what that testing looks like,
right.
But there better be some kind of really robust, strategic, proactive, methodical, how else can I say this, vetting process that to the best of your ability, you've slowed it down and said, man, before I lay hands on this guy and anoint him in front of the congregation and give him this kind of authority and power and influence, do I really have the right guy in place? Yeah. And I've just seen, this is all coming from the negative side of this, right? I mean, this is just learning from experience and watching this. And I think it was the grace of God. I didn't set out, I don't think I was smart in this. I'll be honest with you. So I took over a church that had deacons, and there were men and women, and it was not a Reformed church. So there's been a lot of change. We could talk about that for forever. However, it took us about 11 years to move to finally install elders. I'm not saying do that.
Right.
Ours was a change, right? It was literally a complete change in a polity that was already there. But I will say this, I took great consolation in the fact that it took John Piper 10 years to get to eldership. And I thought, okay, well, I'm not as smart as Piper, and he's a way better preacher and all that than I am. And
just 10% slower.
That's it. But it only took 1 year longer than him. But to be honest with you, I remember hearing that about Bethlehem and taking sort of this internal note in my mind and thinking, don't rush this. Yeah. Do not rush this. And then remembering what Paul said. And then I had to look at the people in my church, my guys, and then I had to think through a process. And that's a whole different discussion. And I think everybody has to have their process for how they do that. But I would just say to any young guys who are just starting out and planting a church, it probably should take you 2 years longer, maybe 3. I'd be interested in your guys' input on this. Dave, I mean, you've been doing this a long time and have seen a lot of churches and have planted a lot of churches. But I feel like it should probably take you a 2 to 3 to 4 years longer than you actually think it will take you to get to that point. Even if you're like, oh, I think I've got 2 really amazing guys. Slow down, pump the brakes.
It's so wise.
Marinate on it for a while and just let the Lord sort of bring some guys to the surface. Because even with that process, there's no guarantee, right? We all know people that have lived double lives and gone sideways and whatever. But I think the slowness of that will guard you from a lot of pain.
Yeah.
A lot of pain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Amen.
Yeah. Yeah. This is interesting because it's come up in some different contexts and some different discussions. And so if you kind of listen to some other points, one of the things we've done recently in Acts 29 to help guys in the planning pipeline is we didn't write them a method of how to get from no elders to elders, but we wrote a framework that would help you do exactly what you're talking about and give you some bones, a little bit of a trellis on which to grow and learn to develop elders and not do it too quickly, not do it too slowly, all of that sort of thing. And it is really, really, really important. Yeah. What you're talking about
These
matters.
Guys are huge influencers. Huge. I mean, and just horror stories.
Yeah. Yeah.
A friend of mine who went on break and comes back and he doesn't have his church anymore. They send him on sabbatical when he comes back. And you're like, how does this happen? Well, what I don't know. I don't know. I don't want to, we take all those First Timothy and Titus and First Peter, right? We take all that very seriously. I just have not seen us elevate this idea of don't be hasty.
Well, and that's
don't be hasty.
Yeah, and I love that you're bringing it up, and it is one of the things that, like, as guys move into assessment and then into like coaching and cohorts, it's built in now into that we just say, hey, everybody needs to take this framework and figure out how you're going to work through exactly what you're talking about over the next 4 years. Yeah. And we've got a coach and a cohort to help you do that, so you don't have to figure it out on your own.
Yeah.
But that thing is critical because moving too fast or moving too slow has all kinds of implications.
I agree.
I'd love to hear what process you guys have for making elders. We have a process, but I'd love to hear what you guys are doing to sort of address that.
And here's where I think it's contextual, Dave, because what happened to me is I had early on at the church, my theology shifted. I was becoming fully reformed. Acts 29 came in the picture later on. I started attending Gospel Coalition meetings in Los Angeles with a group of guys there, and I literally went because I personally had never belonged to a church growing up that had a plurality of elders ever. It was always the prophet, priest, and king, the number one guy. He did that kind of thing. So I had no experiential reference whatsoever of what it looked like to be in a church where the polity was, where the elders were in the first chair, if you will. So I literally was like, I don't know how to do this. I do not know how to do this. So I remember going and like, now what do you do? How'd you do this? Then I went to a church and they were doing this kind of, hey, here's how we do what we do, and we were learning from them. And I raised my hand at one point because they were talking about how they did elders. And they had some really helpful things to say. Super helpful, character, competence, capacity, the 5C, that whole thing. But I said, what do you guys do about educating them and helping them if they're supposed to be able to teach and refute those who contradict? What do you do? And the answer, and this was fine because it was their context, said, well, most of our guys, we've got like 3 seminaries in town. So this was in the South. And they're all, most of them have a theological education. And I was like, oh, okay. So this is where I don't have that. So that set me on a path to create what really started out, I just called it a men's leadership. And these guys had no idea what I was doing. Mm-hmm. And I started just taking these guys and trying to put them almost through like a little boot camp and really try to teach them theology and application and practical and seeing how they would interact with things and even asking them questions about almost case studies that were getting them to see if I could see them make the connection between what they were learning and shepherding people. And suddenly there were some that started to rise through the surface. I'm like, oh, okay. I think we've got some guys who are beginning to emerge through that. So that kind of created this process now that we have, that we've put in place, and it's a lot of theology and reading and personal application, and trying to understand who I am as a man and a husband and in my vocation and my family, in the church, and trying to put that together. And it takes us about a year to get through. So that's the process. But it started with the recognition that I did not have any plug and play guys. And so I needed to develop them and then even try to help them understand what it meant to be an elder at Foothill Church. Because like I said, that group of guys had no idea they were being looked at.
Right.
And it was out of that I grabbed a couple of them, and then I took them aside and started getting more into the like, okay, here, I think you guys are elder candidates. Let's start talking about what this looks like. Yeah. And then I could start talking to them even more practically about that. So that's kind of the process.
That's so great.
Yeah. So.
Well, I mean, we could sit here and talk about evangelism, preaching and voice and elder processes and all that, but I so appreciate you guys and the way you're leading your churches, planting churches, contending for the gospel. inviting people, submitting to elders, all of those things. It's a joy to have you guys here, be a part of it. So
Likewise.
thanks for being on.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Acts 29 podcast. If you want to connect with Acts 29 or find out more about planting a church with Acts 29, you can go to acts29.com. Go ahead and hit like on the podcast and don't forget to subscribe so that you don't miss an episode. Thanks again for joining us.